want to talk today about why we need vision in our software and how to user test correctly so as not to destroy that vision. So in the second season of The Simpsons, there was an episode entitled, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" where Danny DeVito plays Homer's long-lost half-brother Herb. And Herb was the head of Powell Motors and feels that his company needs some fresh ideas. So after meeting Homer, he realizes that the average American nature of Homer makes him the perfect person to design a new car for his company. And after being given full control over the design of the car, Homer creates this. And it has a cup holder that's big enough for big gulps, and some tail fins, and a separate soundproof bubble dome to separate him from his noisy children. 3 car horns that all play La Cucaracha, some shag carpeting. It's a pretty cool car. But when it was released to the market, the car does so terribly that Homer's newfound rich brother goes bankrupt and ends up living on the street, making it one of the darkest Simpsons episodes of all time. Herb Powell thought that Homer made a great everyman whose perspective should dictate the direction of the product. And the only issue I see with this is that an exclusively everyman perspective doesn't leave much room for vision. Status quo perspective creates status quo design. And I believe that it was Steve Jobs who once said that Henry Ford once said, "If I asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse." And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to allude or paint a picture that an end user's perspective isn't valuable. And user testing regularly shows me mistakes or oversights in our designs. I kind of see it like a designer's spell check. And that Henry Ford quote can't be used to say, people are idiots and I'm the genius. But you can't be overly reliant on user testing either, which is the thesis of this talk. User testing and A/B testing are tools at your disposal and are an input into a decision and not a decision in and of itself. And treating it that way has a tendency to lead you back towards this. And I've heard certain people in the tech community state that in today's A/B testing world that designers aren't necessarily needed. It's the same idea that with enough time and bananas, that monkeys will write War and Peace, and that we can A/B test from something scribbled on a napkin and evolve it into a beautiful final state, as if it's an engineering problem. And, maybe we can. There's a famous case of Google's 41 Shades of Blue. And while at Google, Marissa Mayer, who now, well, I guess she was the CEO of Yahoo, but has just recently left, was trying to diplomatically settle a dispute over which shade of blue to use for a toolbar. They A/B tested 41 different shades to arrive at a conclusion, and a managing director claims that specific color change benefited them to the tune of $200 million. He stated that using data avoids defaulting to the highest paid person's opinion. And I think it's kind of a rare occasion that the designer is the highest paid person in a decision change, which leads me to believe that they don't necessarily trust their designers. And here's the byproduct of that. For those who aren't economists, I'll clarify. $200 million is quite a lot of money. And other than claim that they're lying, how can you fairly argue that Google is making a bad decision? They are a business that's publicly traded and whose goal is to make money in ways that align with their declared values. Selecting a color through A/B testing is hardly evil, but you could argue that they might be statistically wrong. Testing 41 shades of blue is almost a sure thing you're generating a false positive. And a false positive is like when you get beeped going through the metal detector for a simple belt buckle. It registered, but it's not the type of object they're looking for. And this translates to Google's 41 shades of blue, and that there are plenty of variables that might have led folks to register a false positive. And hat tip to Jason Cohen for who I got. And just to clarify, there seems to be some static noise. If everybody could go on mute, that'd be great. So if you test 2 shades of blue, you'll get a winner at a 95% confidence level and a 5% chance of a false positive. Test 3 shades of blue, and you'll have a 9% chance of a false positive. Keep going to 41 shades, and you'll have a 88% chance of a false positive. Also, testing for something so specific is far too myopic. There are larger contexts that need to be considered that looking at something in this fashion might not make you aware of. And just a moment, I'm going to try to figure out some of these audio issues. A little tricky without having a mouse in full screen. So maybe I can't take care of it here, but I'll just keep going and hopefully somebody puts themselves on mute. So A/B testing a specific color of blue solved a user issue on one of Google's products, but the way they handled it didn't consider some of the implications of handling it that way. So take a look at their different products. In these examples, there's different shades of blue all over the place. Even the G in Gmail is not the same as the rest. And it was pretty messy, but it didn't break the bank for Google. And looking at something so specific seems to ignore what it could mean if you took into consideration the whole enchilada. It kind of lacks a cohesive vision. And for a real world example, let's take a look at the building. If you look at any single building, they often look fine. Nothing award-winning, but it makes sense why it is the way it is. It's cost-effective and an efficient use of space, and no one's going to lose their job over using that as a guideline for a building. That's not a bad-looking building, but when you start to use the same logic for every building, you end up with a very boring skyline. And it's not the fault of any individual architect, but collectively it adds up to a problem. There are real-world consequences to things like this. Our environments change and shape who we are. And I'll get into some specifics of that later, but in short, it just lacks vision. And people want to go where there's vision. Location and price are primary factors, but people are willing to pay more for places with culture. And you can see this repeat over and over again. Artists move to a dilapidated, cheap location, and they improve culture to the point where people pay attention, building in things like artisan mayonnaise shops, which is coincidentally something I literally saw in Brooklyn once. And these things increase property values to the point that banks and drugstores replace the artists, and the artist finds new playgrounds and rinse and repeat, gentrify, gentrify, gentrify. And I don't use examples of gentrification to specifically call out it as a positive or negative aspect of our lives, just to illustrate that we want to live where we're inspired. We want to see points of view with a vision. And really, when I say vision, it's almost a synonym for culture. So let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. What is culture? And culture is the beliefs, customs, arts, etc. of a particular society, group, place, or time. And this basically boils down to how people express themselves intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm mostly interested in talking about the arts in particular and how people express unique points of view or vision. And when I think about television, I get excited about shows with vision. And there's a show, Atlanta, that just came out on FX in the US and went on to break records for basic cable premiere ratings. And it's a show with an entirely Black writing staff who intend to share parts of the Black experience not currently shown on TV. And that's a cool vision. They were right and picked up some Emmys along the way for their last season. And I haven't seen this point of view reflected on television, and it's refreshing. And if you went by what the numbers told you, that show doesn't make any sense. User tests show that the broadest audience wants the next Duck Dynasty or Kardashians. They make a lot of money and can be a lot of fun, but they don't necessarily move our culture forward. Back when Captain Kirk and Uhura from Star Trek kissed on screen in '68, it was one of the first interracial kisses on screen. And NBC execs tried to talk them out of it. But they did it anyways, and people still talk about it, about how it helped change the perception of interracial relationships. And left to a focus group, a move like that likely wouldn't have happened. Testing alone just doesn't produce vision. So take the song Bohemian Rhapsody by this band called Queen. And this song screams vision. It's the exact thing that never could be created by handling decisions like the way Google picks their colors. The time-tested and literally tested pop-perfect length for a song is 2 minutes and 42 seconds. And this song's over twice that. Past success dictated that songs should be simple and easy to digest, but this has 6 unique sections with 3 key changes and 3 different time signatures, making it one of the most complex pop songs ever written. And it's incredibly tough to fit into a specific genre. Radio just didn't know what to do with it, yet it's the only song to hit #1 in different decades, and it's influenced new artists, and you can hear that in influence in songs like Radiohead's Paranoid Android or My Chemical Romance's Welcome to the Black Parade. It taught our ears to evolve to new sounds and also to listen to familiar sounds in a new fashion, which as a culture we need to be pushed. At the advent of Western music, Gregorian Chant had one harmony. It had the root note and the 5th note of the scale, and that's it. All music was that, and anything else was literal blasphemy. When people introduced the 3rd note into a harmony, it was considered demonic. But somehow we weren't smote by the hand of God when people started using it, and now a harmony with a root, 5th, and a 3rd is the most standard chord in music for centuries now. Pushing forward evolved culture. In 1913, when Stravinsky introduced the ballet The Rite of Spring, he apparently pushed people farther than they were comfortable with. When they heard the music for the first time, the packed venue freaked. People began fighting each other and tossing anything available at the orchestra. But these days, when people hear it, they don't tend to do that anymore. Eventually, people got used to it, and now it's a heralded piece of work. We need to push ourselves, but still make things digestible and find the balance. There's a scene in the 2006 movie Children of Men, and which the movie set in 2027, where Michael Caine's 72-year-old character plays music in the background that, to my ears, is basically noise. Lots of screaming and whips. And there might be something more nuanced going on there that I'm not recognizing, but I think it illustrates the point of building cultural bridges. This is crazy to my ears now, but the movie's trying to suggest that either this man has always listened to radical whip and screaming music, or more likely that between 2006, when the movie was made, to 2027, that music has evolved to a point that there's a reasonable chance that a 72-year-old person would listen to music like this. And regardless of that being believable, the idea is acknowledging that people's tastes towards culture are evolving over time. I once went to the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, which is well known for being a place that car manufacturers pluck talent for vehicle design. And their showcase for the car designs is kind of like a 8-year window into the future. Cars take a long time to produce and to get certified, so they're working on growing people's taste to arrive at the same place 8 years into the future to avoid a similar scenario that Stravinsky went through. And it's a trip as you watch car parts over the years evolve to the designs that look so crazy when you saw them 8 years prior. So these are examples of pushing and evolving culture and getting the public on board with it. And here's a really good example of testing telling you one thing, but feeling confident enough with your vision to ignore it. And that's Air on Chairs, which is kind of the classic .com throne. And when talking about comfy office chairs, they're often the first ones brought up. But when it was originally designed in the 90s, it really weirded people out. and it was described as uncomfortable and alien, regardless of the rigorous ergonomic research they did. As people used it more, testing results seemed to improve, but not to the level that Herman Miller uses as a baseline for which chairs to release. They knew that testing can help identify problems, but testing alone does not produce vision, which I'm happy about because they're great chairs. I like those chairs. And people were so used to what they knew a chair was supposed to be that they had to ease into the idea that a chair could be something different. People know what they know, and by the converse, they don't know what they don't know. Herman Miller had a vision of what a chair could be and knew that testing could help, but testing alone wouldn't get them what they needed. I mentioned before that looking at a single data point is far too myopic, and we assume we understand why that data point came to be, but it's often more complex than that. So, for example, take New Coke. And the whole reason that New Coke existed was because of testing. CocaCola in the 80s was losing ground to Pepsi, so they taste tested a new formula until it was performing better than Pepsi and threw it out to the public with a very large marketing campaign. And it tanked. And I mean, it really tanked. It led to the largest sales increase in Pepsi's history. And as a single data point, taste would be a top priority for a drink to focus on. It makes total sense for taste to be the thing you want to improve. But what they didn't think about is the implications of marketing New Coke as a change. So let's talk about this for a second, because this stuff is like pretty crazy. US Southerners in particular saw it as a core part of their regional identity. And I've read comparisons of New Coke as another surrender to the Yankees. And when New Coke showed up on the Jumbotron in the Houston Astrodome in Texas, people booed. And Coke got over 400,000 calls and letters about this. And keep in mind, this is prior to the organizational powers of the internet. And they'd get 20 times the call volumes on the Coke hotline. So they ended up hiring a psychiatrist to evaluate those calls, and who said that the callers spoke as if they were describing a death of a family member. Fidel Castro even got in on the game and said that it was symptomatic of American decay. And the CEO of Coke at the time, his father was Cuban and escaped the Castro regime and absolutely hated Castro. But for whatever reason, this was the one thing he saw eye to eye on with Castro. His father happened to live in Mexico City and said that the city was in an uproar about New Coke, which was interesting because it hadn't even arrived in Mexico City at the time. So this is an interesting example because my argument is that looking at a single data point too closely is dangerous, but this also runs counter to the point I was making earlier that testing can lead you to being too conservative and lack vision. But in this case, Coca-Cola had a vision of a better tasting product that was held back by the public's conservative view of what it should be. So, enough examples. Let's get back to why this matters for software. And this is just software, right? It's a tool to get us from point A to point B. Why does it need culture? And how does that help me in my day-to-day? And what utility does that add? If Google's making 200 million by selecting a specific shade of blue, who are we to say that they should only make 100 million if they choose this different shade of blue? So let's talk about the benefit of culture in our own real-world cities. Introducing culture and the arts into a city has been found to reduce stress, to make people feel happier with their lives and satisfied with their health. Communities with high engagement in the arts are more involved in their area, and there are a ton of economic benefits, as it was called out before, with how culture and the arts gentrifies neighborhoods. And the arts make people more empathetic to the world around them. And you might see at the bottom, I've linked these studies for you if you're curious about finding out more. And we are escaping into our social media sites and apps at an ever-increasing pace. And we need to be thinking about how we shape culture in these spaces too. These days, kids think of phones the way people used to think of cars. As kids hit their teens, they're looking to establish their own identity and separate themselves more from their parents. When we were 16, the car was our way to escape our parents and a signal of moving towards adulthood. And now it's smartphones. In 2011, 46% of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they'd rather have access to the internet than access to a car. And I couldn't find more recent stats, but I'm willing to bet that that percentage has gone up. As we move more and more into the digital world, we need to treat our virtual spaces the same way as our physical spaces. With the internet age still in its infancy, we're shaping how culture works with how we're tackling things like online bullying and anonymous harassment, with how we're handling privacy, how we're handling the mashup of other real world cultures that we've never had this much amount of access to. So let's look at a few examples. So this one is Spotify and Star Wars. And so when listening to a Star Wars related album on Spotify, they changed the progress bar into a lightsaber. And it's fun and cute and expresses a little bit about themselves, in that I don't think they would have done this if they weren't Star Wars fans. Emoji and Yelp search. So if you want to have an interesting time searching in Yelp, try using emojis. You'll get some pretty fun results. And it's just a little touch that adds a sense of play to their app. Day and night mode in Apple Maps. When you zoom out to a specific level, Apple Maps shows where it's currently dark. And it's a detail that most map apps don't pay attention to. Also, rather than plotting a dot for a city, they actually simulate the light projected from the metro area. And it's a nice little touch that shows they care about the product. Thinspo on Tumblr. Okay, this one's a little more important. Thinspo is a term for sites that promote unhealthy body images of extremely thin people that others use as inspiration to lose weight. And people who go to these sites tend to suffer from a negative body image. And Tumblr pops up this PSA when people search for Thinspo and offers up some help if somebody needs it. And they make the link go back supersized while diminishing the view search results link. Multiracial emojis. So sometimes expressing culture is more than just cute. When multiracial emojis were added to iOS and Android, a large portion of the internet celebrated. And it turns out that a bunch of the country doesn't see themselves as Simpsons Americans. And this one, this Drake from Degrassi, that's a really funny joke to me. That really got me. But when it should be noted that when news of this came out, my fiance updated her OS faster than I've ever seen her, because people really care about this. Not having it held back people from communicating this way, in ways that they wanted to. And maybe one of the biggest strides in adding culture into software is Apple's introduction of accessibility. And since then, Google's also done a lot on this front. I saw posts by blind people spring up saying that it changed their life overnight. And one started off with, "Last Wednesday, my life changed forever. I got an iPhone. I consider it the greatest thing to happen to the blind for a very long time, possibly ever. It offers unparalleled access to properly made applications and changed my life in 24 hours. These are examples of injecting creativity and culture, and focusing on these details are going to matter even more, especially as we delve into the mix of design and artificial intelligence. And don't worry, for a good long time, or at least I hope a good long time, we should be relatively safe from our design jobs becoming obsolete. AI should go a long ways towards doing 90% of your PowerPoint decks, but it'll be some time before it picks a picture as cool as this. AI will be able to do a lot of our legwork, but leave it to us to inject the personality, vision, and culture. As AI takes care of the rest, thinking about these things are going to be foremost on our mind. So when crafting our software, we need to be thinking about the type of world we want our digital spaces to be. We want it to have a point of view, but not to the point of being difficult to figure out. We want to have a chuckle, but not slow down what we're trying to accomplish. We want thoughtful software that shows that it's crafted with care, not because it's made by people who are trying to squeeze every dollar they can, but because it's made by people who care about solving a problem well. So can I make the case that $200 million in additional revenue isn't worth cultural benefits they would have gotten had they gone with the designer's vision? No, not really. But let's take a look at where Google as a company has gone since the era of 41 Shades of Blue. The person in charge of the design of Google's products left the company, and co-founder Larry Page returned to take over the post. And at one point during Google's early years, Larry Page declared that he thought the company's design aesthetic was Pine, a command line email client that was first written in 1989. And it makes sense from an engineer's perspective in that it's fast and efficient, very utility focused. It's not easy to learn, but if you have it down, you can get it around really quickly. And that's definitely reflected in the design of most of Google's history. But something changed with Larry Page since he said that back in 2001. And he recognized that we're in a new computer age where we need to realize that my grandmother can't use Pine, but grandma needs to be forwarding those chain letter emails. So he instant messaged his design team and asked, if you were to redesign Google, what would it look like? And coincidentally, a few years earlier than this, the Google design team attempted this exact thing and was met by Marissa Mayer, the product person, with and it didn't really go anywhere. The only difference this time is now they have the CEO bringing it up himself. And so they came up with their new design language they called material design, which when it was announced, got me as excited as the first time I laid my eyes on any product they've released. It was cohesive, it was well thought out, and it had vision. And so they slowly rolled it out over all their properties. And now instead of several fiefdoms, each looking like they came to their own testing-based conclusions, they feel like a family that feels familiar when you switch between them, which has real usability benefits. And when it was applied to Android, it felt like it was the first time that it truly came into its own. And they clearly arrived there hand in hand with testing, but not led by testing. So how do you handle testing as to not negatively affect the design of your product? Test from a strong hypothesis. Feel free to break the rules. Test the middle. And use the Whitney Houston method. So let's break these down. Testing using a strong hypothesis. And this is a good formula for basing a test. And if you can fit it into this statement, it's likely structured in a way in which you can have some faith in the results. Changing the button text from sounds good to hell yeah will increase people pushing the button. You're aiming to change the user's behavior. And also, the goal shouldn't necessarily be about getting an improvement, but rather learning more about your users. If you see less engagement because of a change, that's not necessarily a loss. Try to understand why you saw a decrease, and that will help you not just for this specific test, but for understanding your product in general. So be specific. You can throw spaghetti at the wall just to see what sticks, but I would only recommend that if you're trying to generate ideas and that you finally test it as a specific hypothesis. And also be honest with your hypothesis. Don't use it disingenuously. I've watched people use testing as a weapon. I've seen accusations of being disingenuous with the results. And I've seen testing used to sabotage project timelines, which is directly out of the CIA's playbook. Literally, the CIA has a playbook entitled Simple Sabotage, and it states inside there, when possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make the committees as large and bureaucratic as possible. And when I've seen this happen, it's not because there's a genuine curiosity as to what the outcome would be and how that'd be great for the user. it was out of wanting evidence to confirm their bias. The true focus in this situation wasn't the customer, but an imbalance in a work relationship. And power struggles don't tend to make for good products. So, number 2, feel free to break the rules and don't get hung up on already established rules. So, for example, I bet many people remember the term above the fold. And this was a time-tested rule that went back to the early days of newspapers. You wanted your most important stories and photos to be on the upper half of the front page before the paper is folded, so when it's put on display, it has the best impact for potential readers. And on digital devices, this refers to the visible area of the screen prior to needing to scroll for more content. And there was a time when this rule was the holy grail. If you weren't above the fold, your click-throughs were terrible. And real-world results and testing showed this. It made it real. But something changed, and it's a combination of 3 different things. The fight to be above the fold became so big that people were attempting to do too much on one screen in the if everything's special, then nothing is special kind of way. And websites are about trying to tell stories, and people were becoming bad storytellers. Another reason is that touchscreens became a thing. And people appear to be more comfortable manipulating a screen than to scroll a mouse. It feels that you're close to physically moving content compared to how it feels using a scroll bar or a scroll wheel. And that also might have had played a part in the third reason, in that people on non-touchscreen computers are scrolling more on web pages. And maybe it's because trackpads on computers are more prevalent, maybe because people got used to doing it on a touchscreen device, or maybe after 20 years of websites, people have evolved to understand the medium better. And regardless, this established rule isn't as established as it used to be. It used to be mandated as law, but people have changed and evolved. So number 3, test the middle. When coming up with your hypothesis, don't test individual colors or one-off font sizes. That should be part of a consistent style guide, and not doing so leads to the same problem that Google had, in which every website used something slightly different, and that has, usability issues. Also, don't put too much credo into testing a grand vision. Testing is like a mirror that reflects back what it's already familiar with. User testing often doesn't know what to do with what it doesn't understand. And a good vision will find its audience regardless of what testing says. So test the middle, not the grand vision itself, but the features and components that comprise the grand vision. Do users complete this feature? Does that button get pushed more when it's at the top of the layout or at the bottom? Does this paragraph perform better than this other paragraph? And when doing this, observe, don't ask. Actions speak louder than words, and you can regularly see that in what a user does compared to what a user might report back. The middle is your sweet spot. So number 4, use the Whitney Houston method. How do you identify when you have a true vision for the future versus something that tested poorly and you're fooling yourself over? When Herman Miller was testing air-on chairs and not getting their usual results, how did they know they had a winner on their hands? How do you cut through people's past experiences, prejudices, knowledge, biological functions to identify a true vision for the future rather than just a bad idea? And I believe it was famed UX researcher and 6-time Grammy Award winner Whitney Houston who once said, "I believe the children are our future, and we need to let them lead the way." And I'd be remiss not to mention that it was actually Linda Creed who wrote the lyrics, but that's not nearly as funny. So there's a scene in Danny Boyle's movie, Steve Jobs, in which he sticks his daughter Lisa in front of a Macintosh, and she intuitively grasps the concept of the interface on the screen, how to use the mouse to manipulate it. But back in the day, not everyone responded as naturally as Lisa did. And here's a call out from John C. Dvorak in '84 about the release of the Mac. And he said, The Macintosh uses an experimental pointing device called a mouse. There's no evidence that people want to use these things. Now, you can't exactly throw an army of children at your test to identify if your product is right, but maybe if your product is broad enough. But if you're thinking you have something revolutionary in your B2B mortgage insurance app, no number of kids are going to help you figure that out. I'm more specifically interested in that childlike innocence rather than youth. Find testers who are able to approach a test with a fresh slate in conjunction with industry insiders. Completing user tests with only industry insiders is in danger of being affected by confirmation bias, basically already affecting their judgment based on past experience. But if you can balance that with industry outsiders to get a fresh take, it allows for a much more balanced test and avoids bias. And kind of as an aside, kids are a great way to take a look at the future of user interfaces. If you look at something like Snapchat, it breaks a lot of the so-called design rules that we have, especially with video and overlaying content on top of video. But it's really taking off and is a clear sign of what the future holds for user interfaces. So to recap, test using a strong hypothesis, feel free to break the rules, test the middle, and use the Whitney Houston method. So what do you do now that you have results? You should figure out what's right, not based on numbers exclusively, but in tandem with where you feel you want to take people. User testing is a mirror that reflects the present, but won't necessarily know how to deal with future vision. And if you look at these rules and think about Homer's car, they followed some of these rules for certain. They felt free to break the rules, and Homer was definitely an outsider, but they didn't use a strong hypothesis, and they didn't test the middle. And maybe most importantly, they didn't observe, but they asked. They didn't observe Homer's use of a car, but they asked Homer, a man with no experience in creating products, to make a car. User testing and A/B testing are great tools at your disposal and are an input into a decision and not a decision in and of itself. Testing alone does not produce vision. And as we escape into our digital spaces at an ever-increasing pace, we need to be thinking about how we shape culture in these spaces too. So that's all I have. Thank you for the time.